This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. It's another in my series of interviews with presidential candidates. Gloria La Riva is the woman before you. She's the nominee for the Peace and Freedom Party and the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Gloria La Riva is my guest. She is running for the office of American President on the Peace and Freedom Parties and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I like to give all of my guests a little time to introduce themselves. So Gloria, before we get into the heart of the issues, please take a minute or two and tell viewers about yourself.
My name is Gloria La Riva. I was born in Albuquerque, born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, of Mexican-American parents. My mother is actually from Mexico, and my dad was Mexican-American from southern New Mexico. I lived there with 5 other siblings until I went to college at Brandeis University, and that's where I learned about the struggle, about how I got into college through affirmative action and the actions of African-American students who took over building in the school at the time of 1968, which was a time of a lot of radicalism across the U.S. and campuses. And so from that, I learned a lot about socialism, and by the end of the school year, I decided I had to be a socialist. I organized a union drive at the age of 23 to 24 in Rochester, New York, of a newspaper, of women newspaper workers. We won the election and got fired the next day. Never got a contract, but I got my union card. I moved to San Francisco in 1981, where I have lived ever since. I have been a longtime union activist. I worked for 36 years at the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Francisco Examiner. The two operated in a joint operating agreement. And for 8 years, I was the full-time president of the Bay Area Typographical Union. I'm now the vice president of the Pacific Media Workers Guild, which represents journalists and print workers in the Bay Area.
Well,
so I've been an activist since I was 19. The other is I'm actually endorsed by the Peace and Freedom Party in California. I will be the nominee. I'm the presumptive nominee, but for the delegated convention in August, we have more than enough votes to win the nomination. And I am the Peace and Freedom, I'm the Party for Socialism and Liberation candidate across the country. In Vermont, I'm nominated by the Liberty Union Party.
Okay. Well, I've been a member of 4 unions. I'll get to right to work laws and that later in the interview. But let me just, if you could delineate the 2 parties that you are nominated for, Peace and Freedom and Party for Socialism and Liberation. Is there any particular difference between them, or are they basically very congruous parties?
I think our politics are very similar. The Peace and Freedom Party was founded in the height of the anti-war and the Black liberation movement in California. It was started by anti-war activists at the time of the Vietnam War, progressive people, and in a strong alliance with the Black Panther Party, was able to win enough signatures to get on the ballot. Ever since then, the process started in 1967, became formalized in 1968, and has been on the ballot ever since. I think it's a great accomplishment because it's not easy. It hasn't been easy for socialist parties, and yet now its popularity is greater, and we're winning a lot more adherents, more people registering to vote. Peace and Freedom. The Party for Socialism and Liberation was founded in June 2004, so we're 16 years old now this month, and we are a party in which the vast majority are youth and people from across the country, more than 100 cities that we're engaged in our 16 years. I think the growth has been especially since Trump's election, and in the last year, definitely, in the time of the pandemic, in the time of the struggle for Black Lives Matter. Well, huge increase in socialism.
Yeah. Well, let me get right to some of the top issues of the day. We're recording this in the year 2020 when you are running, and the two major issues right now, or the two major problems that are front and center in the country, we'll get to some of the other stuff too, are the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement in response to the beatings and killings of black people. Let me just start with the pandemic, since you mentioned that first. COVID-19 has been botched by many countries, ours countries included. People are dying, it seems, unnecessarily, and especially hard hit are minority communities and people on reservations, Native Americans. I interviewed Mark Charles, a Native American who's running for president a few months ago as well, and it's gotten worse since I interviewed him. If you were president, what were some of the steps you would take to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic and also help mitigate possible future pandemics?
If I were president
Yeah.
and had the power that Trump is exercising against the people in these last 4 years, if I had the power as president, I would declare and actually invoke the Defense Production Act, which was supposed to be for beefing up the U.S. war, the bombing war, the genocidal war against Korea from 1950 to 1953. Nevertheless, that act gives the power of the government to employ the productive forces of the country, the factories, in order to produce millions and millions, hundreds of millions of masks, to produce the ventilators, and also to create a program whereby all the workers would be tested in essential work. They haven't been yet. The food workers, the grocery, the meat packing plants. Instead, Trump has issued an executive order that beef, chicken, and pork is essential. He's really just backing up the profiteers. But in other words, we would use the Defense Production Act for everything that's needed to help people survive this crisis. We're reaching now 113,000 deaths today, and it'll go up by 1,000 every day. It has ever since. We've seen now reports as of this interview's date that the CDC and other agencies are saying that the number of cases is reaching record levels. Even though it was going down, the fact that Memorial Day weekend, the reopening without the provisions needed of mass testing should be provided to everybody, and then contact tracing, all these things we've heard about. This is not a mystery, what we would do as president. And certainly, instead of rescuing the banks by trillions of dollars, Wall Street, and pumping out the money on a daily basis, the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve Bank say we will use whatever resources we need for saving their system. And what we think should happen is income provided to all the workers to maintain their income so that they can survive this pandemic and stay home. And for those that are needed for food production and other absolute essentials, to be able to work safely. This is all possible, and it's a crime how many people have died unnecessarily. When you think about who's died, you also have to think about the over 1 million people who've had the virus. It takes a long time to recover, and then when they recover, they're not at their full status that they were before. There's a lot of health problems that exist afterwards. What about the families who lost their loved ones who were the breadwinner, the one who they depended on for income and sustenance as a family? Well, people should get compensation for what this government has failed to do. The other is, I think it's very important to know that we all understand it's an international, it's a worldwide phenomenon and a crisis. The only way to overcome it is to cooperate with all countries. And therefore, we would immediately lift the ban on trade, on financial relations with Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, North Korea, Iran, all those sanctions that the U.S. imposes on countries, especially those that I mentioned, but some 70 countries have some form of sanctions applied to them because they're resisting U.S. foreign policy. They should be lifted. Do you know that the average percentage of people who get into a critical state in the U.S., 80% of the people die. And in Cuba, it's proven and they're very scientific about it, methodical in keeping track of everyone who's been positive, the contact tracing. 80% of the people who reach critical state in Cuba survive. 80%, because they have medicines that they combine in their usage, and thanks to their biotechnology and their medical field, that is applied to everyone that needs it for free. Nobody pays for healthcare in Cuba. And in Venezuela, until a couple of weeks ago, the number of people who had died from COVID-19 was 10. 10 people. It sounds astounding, but they essentially flattened the curve from the outset. When it became known as a pandemic, everybody was required to stay home, state of emergency, like what we needed here, and all the rents and mortgages, even for business, was canceled for at least 6 months. So nobody had to worry about going out to work if they didn't have to pay for their housing and to pay for their food. These are the things that were kept from knowing in the United States, and why the blockade is imposed in order to try to crush countries like revolutionary Cuba and revolutionary Venezuela, the revolutionary government that puts people first before profits. And that's our crisis. The crisis of the pandemic is really the crisis of capitalism.
Well, I've often said that we need a new currency beside pelf, something, a currency of accomplishment. But let me just ask you, concomitant to COVID, I would assume you are for Medicare for all or something similar. And what do you think of President Trump's wanting to withdraw from the World Health Organization?
I think Trump withdrawing from the World Health Organization is a travesty, and it's a really criminal act against the people of the U.S. and the people of the world. He has used threats and sanctions. He's overturned so many measures in the EPA, environmental protection. Everything that he has done has been against the people and against humanity, against the planet. But in terms of Medicare for all, I think it's a good start. But Medicare for all implies some form of operating under the system of capital, and what we believe is that healthcare should be completely free. Now, it's entirely possible to have healthcare for all and free right now with reforms, but that's a struggle that is probably in the future, because the people have to, I think, rise up as a nation to demand it. When Bernie Sanders was running, we thought he was raising very important issues that the other candidates in the Democratic Party, and certainly Trump, wouldn't dare touch. Idea of Medicare for all, he was meaning that nobody should be denied health care, that everybody should be entitled to it. And that would mean eliminating the insurance companies, which are purely parasitic institutions, solely for profit. They deny people health care. But we think that healthcare for all, free, including for everyone who lives in the U.S., the undocumented, but who, by the way, should have full rights immediately, is attainable. How? Today it could be done by taxing big business, by taxing the corporations, which are making hand over fist hundreds of billions of dollars. Whole Foods, Amazon, Tesla, and other corporations. Facebook, Twitter, while people are literally starving in the United States during this pandemic. They should be taxed heavily. Every president, since at least Reagan, the tax breaks for the rich accelerated, starting with Reagan, to where in the 1950s, the tax rate for the richest in the U.S., corporations and individuals, was 70%. Now, with Trump, he lowered the tax rate officially to 25% in 2017. But as soon as he signed the law providing for the tax breaks for the rich, the lobbyists of these corporations, the tens of thousands of lobbyists who fill the halls of Congress, they went in and got provisions for themselves. Effectively, what happened was that last year, the tax rate in the average tax rate that the biggest corporations paid was 11%. Not only are they making huge profits off our labor, but they're not even contributing to the federal budget minimally.
Mhm.
So you have $434 billion that the biggest corporations, the billionaires, have gained during these 3 months of pandemic. And people are getting poorer and poorer. What do we get? $1,200 one time. It took a while to get, and not everybody got it. There's still people entitled to it who haven't received it. And then you're talking of tens of millions who weren't able to pay taxes, people who didn't qualify, the undocumented, so many people.
Well, Gloria, let me go on to the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd issue. I'm 55. I grew up in inner city New York during what would I guess you would call the Serpico era. So I saw a lot of bad stuff that happened in the NYPD back then, and it's only gotten worse, I think, in the last 50 years. So right now, as we speak, it's been only about a month or maybe a little less since a man named George Floyd was killed by a police officer named Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And this has sparked off protests around the country. And there are so many videos that you see of police brutality, and people seem to not want to see it. If you were president, what would you do about the now only a few day old movement of wanting to defund police? Because modern policing is only less than 200 years old. 200 years ago in New York and big cities, you didn't have modern police as we know it. Um, let's deal with the issue first of black people in general being harassed and killed, and what they call now Karens reporting people just for being black, and then the police issue. So if you would.
First of all, we consider what's taken place and has taken place in the U.S. really since the founding of the United States and has continued to today in other forms is a war on Black America. And that's why one of our principal slogans is Stop the War on Black America. I would say what we need to do, and what I would do as president, is what I'm doing now, and that is demonstrating with the millions of people who've been in the streets. Researchers and newspaper people in the media, they have declared that these are historically in the United States the largest number of protests that have ever happened on any issue. And that includes superseding what took place in 2006 when millions of undocumented workers marched for their rights. So the demonstrations for Black Lives Matter against police terror, and also encompassing other demands about economic justice, but the end of racism. As we also say, it's a revolt against racism that's taken. And it has also had the effect of pushing back on all the politicians who for decades, as you described since the 70s certainly, that politicians cater, they bow down to the police departments, to these so-called police unions, which are really mobs of cops. They're not workers in the sense that we understand workers. They uphold in a repressive manner more and more the system of capital. So the police have gotten everything that they demand, militarized forces, armored personnel carriers rolling through the streets of the United States, weapons of war, tear gas and rubber bullets that can kill. They have killed in this struggle for justice for George Floyd. And I think the other thing that has happened in this struggle of since Memorial Day, the day after Memorial Day, and it has had other expressions, justice for Mike Brown, for Philando Castile, for Breonna Taylor. What's happening is that all the families, the thousands of families whose loved ones have been murdered, they're able now to bring back the case of their loved one who was killed by the cops. For example, Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old EMT worker, African American, in Louisville, Kentucky. She was shot to death by the police in misidentification, breaking down the door of her home, that of her and her boyfriend, and they were intruders. So her boyfriend shoots one gun shot, and they fire back with 8 bullets, killing her. killing Breonna Taylor. For all those weeks up until the demonstrations of Black Lives Matter in these last weeks, the police were exonerated, no charges. The city said case closed, and now they're being forced to say we will reinvestigate. Everyone knows it was a crime. Everyone knows it was a murder. But we're talking since the killing of Mike Brown on August 9, 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, we're talking about more than 6,000 people who've been murdered, mostly by gunfire, but also being choked to death, like Eric Garner, like George Floyd. So what we would do, I mean, really, there are many reforms that are being demanded and many that could be employed now. There's so many, it's too much to even detail now. But defunding the police is very important. Why should a family only have the police to call if a loved one or someone they know is suffering a mental crisis? Police come and they shoot them. Endless cases. Why should people call the police for a dispute between neighbors? You know, all these people, white people who have been getting some news attention for having called the police on Black people as either a worker delivering a package to a white gated community, or someone barbecuing at Lake Merritt in Oakland, a Black family barbecuing, and a white woman calls the police to come and arrest them. All these cases, swimming in a swimming pool, a Black student falling asleep in a student lounge, getting the cops called on them, and that woman, infamous woman, who was calling the cops on a Black man who was in a park in Central Park, asking her to leash her dog, and she's furiously calling the police, saying she's being accosted. This is what leads to, when the police get called, it leads to people being killed. And so we say, right now, those people who call the cops should be charged with malicious action, and whatever charges there are on the law books, charge them to stop people feeling that they have impunity to attack their neighbors, to attack African Americans or other people of color. Calling the cops is the last thing one should do, but we need alternatives. So slash the budget, defund the police entirely, create community control, create social services and negotiators, hire negotiators who are professional, and allow the community to help heal the problems in their neighborhoods. There's a lot that can be done. But instead, we're seeing that, for example, this week in San Diego, the city council, despite hearing online the complaints of the public demanding a cut in the police budget, defunding the cops in San Diego, from 11 a.m. to 8 p.m., the lines were filled with people online saying, defund the cops. What happened? They gave a record 27 million increase to the police budget. So the struggle has to continue. Jail killer cops. Everyone who kills someone, a cop who kills someone should be jailed.
Let me just talk a little bit about some of other political stuff before I get into some social policy stuff. The Black Lives Matter movement has shown a light on things, what we're doing internally in the country wrong. But I want to talk about Guantanamo Bay. I want to talk about some political prisoners, overt political prisoners. You're running with Leonard Peltier as your vice president, but some other ones are Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, who fled to Russia. If you were president, what would you do with the case of these political detainees, prisoners, whatever you want? And would you close Guantanamo Bay as a prison to be, as we currently know it?
Well, as president, I would immediately welcome Edward Snowden back and make sure he had protection from the police and federal agencies. We would immediately welcome back Julian Assange with no charges against him. The U.S. is trying to deep six him in prison. It's horrendous how they're treating him. Chelsea Manning, of course, had an outrageous sentence. It was commuted by President Obama, but then you see how she's been punished by being put into prison again for refusing to testify against Julian Assange. They're all more than whistleblowers. They're exposing war crimes of the United States. The political prisoners like Leonard Peltier, Mutulu Shakur, Jalil Muntakim, so many others, Mumia Abu Jamal. There are many, many who are in prison, who have been in prison for 40, almost 50 years now. And they're unknown to the public because the U.S. refuses to recognize that there are political prisons in the United States. But in addition, there must be an immediate releasing of so many thousands of prisoners who are in for parole violation, who for economic crimes, who have excessive sentencing, and are older and more vulnerable to the COVID-19. Immediate release. And in addition, we're talking about 2.5 million prisoners in federal, state, and local jails. It is a result of the mass incarceration policies of the so-called crime laws of the 1980s. It really began under Nixon, but accelerated in the 80s and the 90s, in addition to the effective death penalty and anti-terrorism law signed by Clinton in 1996. So all of these laws must be abolished, because what they've done is imprison people for being poor, imprison people for being Black, Latino, people of color. The rich don't get imprisoned for the crimes that they commit. You can evict 5 million people if you're a banker. The banks did that to the people in the crisis of 2008, 2009, a crisis they caused. But they run free and they get richer and richer ever since. While the people who are poor, who have no means to survive except by informal means, economic acts of survival, they're in prison. So I think that we need an immediate releasing of so many people. And there are plenty of lawyers who know, plenty of prisoners who know that they should be freed. You know, the prisoners never have a voice, but the prisoners know more than anybody about justice. Because once they've been in prison, so many young people who never had a chance in school, never had opportunity, suffered from racism from the day they were born. And sadly, once they go to prison, sometimes they find, you know, that there's opportunities, that they're locked in. Like, for example, in California, where I live, there's a constant call for prisoners to become firefighters. Last year, in the fire season, there were hundreds and hundreds of prisoners who were called to duty to fight the fires. It's a heroic job for all firefighters, but they're never allowed to become firefighters once they get out. They should be allowed to be firefighters. And when you're doing labor in prison, you should get equal pay. If you're doing the job of someone on the outside, you should get equal pay. And you should get minimum pay. And minimum wage should be $15 to $20 an hour for everybody, minimum. There's all kinds of things. We're talking about a radical overhaul of the system, Dan. We're talking about a radical overhaul, and it really requires revolution.
Well, it's been almost 50 years since the Roe versus Wade decision, and we've seen that even though you can get a decision in your favor, people just keep wanting to chip away at it. If you're president and you get a Supreme Court appointee to appoint a Supreme Court justice, do you believe in that the Constitution, as currently written, or as it was originally written, what is a living, breathing document? This is one of the things that you have the originalists and the people who believe that you have to grow and expand as society changes. So what is your thoughts on abortion rights and the Supreme Court?
Well, first, I think the Constitution is a document carved in stone, written by slave owners and the rising capitalist class of the United States, that, of course, eliminated the rights of Black, and enslaved and free people, of Native people who were not recognized as having rights, of women, of people who were not white men who were not property owners. So that was not exactly a democratic document. It was a document to uphold the right of capital. Anyway, it should be completely overthrown, thrown out, and rewritten to benefit the people instead of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that nice abstract kind of slogan. It should say the right to housing, the right to education, the right to health care, free, the right to equality, true equality. I mean, we're still fighting for an equal rights amendment for women, and abolish this idea that if you're in prison, you can still be enslaved, that you have no rights. The system of capital is what has created the laws, the courts, the prison system, everything, the state, in other words. The forces of repression and the forces of enforcement of capitalist law is what needs to be overhauled. But first, the system has to be overturned. It has to be changed. It has to be a radical reformation. And I'm not talking reforms. We're not talking about reforms. We're talking about a complete change in the system to be socialist. Either you have capitalism where the landlords have the right over the tenant, that if you can't pay, then you can be evicted, that if you miss a payment on your mortgage, the bank can evict you, foreclose you, and take your home. We're talking about laws that say that private property rules over the rights of the people. I think people are learning about this more and more. I think that the pandemic is creating a crisis for people where they're saying, this isn't working for me. People who were middle class up to a few months ago and have lost their job, have lost everything, and they're just barely hanging on. They're realizing, why are the bankers getting everything? Why isn't there money for the people? And the poor, who have always been poor, who have nothing to fall back on, they know that the system doesn't work for them. So, in terms of the Supreme Court, it's an anti-democratic institution. One of the most anti-democratic. It's a dictatorship. And depending on the strength of the popular movements of the people, it has, in the past, given progressive decisions like Roe versus Wade that you asked about. The Roe versus Wade decision, giving women the right to control our bodies and our lives to a certain degree. Roe versus Wade came on the heels of a mass women's movement that was already starting in the 50s. It really began when women demanded the right to vote. But certainly in the 50s and the 60s, and things like the development of the pill that gave women more freedom. The women's movement of the 60s and 70s, I was a kid at that time. And we were all affected by that movement. Men and women were affected by that movement. And so the Supreme Court was forced to recognize women's right to abortion. Now, because the women's movement has been pushed back, as all movements have, as a rise of racism from the government and the gutting of social services, of the idea that equality is no longer a right for us. We have seen now that the women's rights to abortion, the right to equal pay, the right to be free from demonization as a single mother or a mother, the right to be free from discrimination, that's being eroded greatly. There are dozens of court cases that are attempting to completely overthrow Roe versus Wade. And the politicians and the courts and the Supreme Court feel that they can get away with it. It's not just a matter of if I were president or a progressive president other than ourselves got to go into the office of president. It's not a matter of, oh, could you pick the next judge? It's the whole institution itself. It's the whole institution of the Supreme Court that continues to uphold executions of people in prison, despite the fact that some of them have been known to be innocent, even recognized by the Supreme Court, But they say, according to our law, you had a fair trial. There's a case in Texas that was the first one that said, quite a number of years ago, maybe 15 years ago, Herrera was the plaintiff. He was a death row inmate. And it was proven after his trial and after his final appeals that he was innocent, factually innocent. The Supreme Court said, well, still, you had a fair trial. We're not going to revisit it. And he was executed. You know, we have to abolish the death penalty in this country. So when you talk about the Supreme Court, we're talking about all the courts. The courts that are based on the excessive sentencing that was written into law, various laws that make crack possession subject to higher sentencing than cocaine, or the idea that if you smoke marijuana, you could still be in prison today, as some people are.
Let me talk about another Supreme Court decision and a couple of other things that, if you were president, you could change with an executive order. Let me start with the Supreme Court decision in 1819 called Dartmouth versus Woodward, and that basically gave corporate personhood to corporations. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's in my view, 200 years later, it's probably the most destructive and far-reaching decision that the Supreme Court's ever made, even worse than the slave laws, because we're still, it's a direct line from that decision to the destruction of the planet that we're seeing with corporations that are just running wild. Are you in favor of corporate personhood or not? And as president, what would you try to do to rein in corporate power?
I definitely don't think that corporations are people. To rein in corporate power, there have been organizations and institutions that have called for canceling the charter that grants corporations the right to, operate.
Corporate death penalty, they call it.
Yeah, it's sort of like the horses have left the barn already. That's like, you could evoke that again. That's not going to happen because we're talking about imperialism, the last stage of capitalism. We're living in the United States, the richest country in the world. Yes, it is the most economically powerful up to this point, although it's greatly losing its position in the world for different reasons. But the corporations, like the war manufacturers, the auto manufacturers, all the huge corporations of the United States, they have the power. The government works for them. As I said, they fill the halls of Congress to write the laws on their behalf for profits. They have the whole police system, the system to uphold them. And they have the courts that uphold the right of private property, whether there were court decisions in the past before. Again, in the 1950s, the taxation rate was very high for them. But now it's been greatly eroded because this is their system. So there can be attempts at reform. There can be demands for increasing their taxation. But what has been the situation for the last 35 years is their tax rate has plummeted to where not only do they pay no taxes, most of the biggest ones, but that we carry the burden in terms of not even having a healthcare system for the people, other than Medicare, which is chipped and chipped and chipped away. And by the way, it's very expensive. I am on Medicare, and it costs a lot for my husband and I. It's a lot of money. And for people who have a lower income, very low income, and I have a worker's income, it's impossible. So people choose not to get the drugs. Even on Medicare, they can't pay for it. But anyway, in terms of corporations being a person, again, it boils down to what we need is a mass movement of millions and millions of people who understand that their role in this system and society is to produce and produce for corporations who have no regard for their life. And that the only thing that they give people in terms of wages or benefits is what the people fight for. You know about unions.
Yeah.
The unions won many gains that we still benefit from.
Yeah.
But in terms of how we make change, how we improve things for people, I'll give an example. The fight for 15.
Mm-hmm.
I often ask people, what politician first raised the demand of fight for 15? What politicians were advocating this to make this a phenomenon? And nobody can answer because nobody did. Bernie Sanders later said fight for $15 an hour minimum wage, as others have now. But it took the unions and the low-wage workers to risk their job, to go on strike, whether they were McDonald's or Whole Foods or Walmart. They went on strike in order to get an increase in their minimum wage. Mm-hmm. It's the people that make things happen. It was a women's movement that won us some rights. It was the Black civil rights movement and the liberation movement of African Americans in this country that pushed back so many of these Jim Crow laws that eliminated the apartheid system in the South. But in many ways, it still exists. The inequality for Black people. And so the struggle is what we have to rely on. I've been asked several times, you've asked me, and they're good questions, what would you do as president? It's a vision of some of the things we would do if we had the power. But that's not going to happen. People go, how can you say you're not going to vote? Then why run? Why run if you're not going to win? We're running for a different reason. As socialists, we're running against the system. And as socialists, we reach in every way we can, whether it's a protest or alternative media or the big media if we can break through sometimes. And we also use the arena of elections, sometimes in lower offices to try to win, but in the office of president, we're not being naive here to say that to be a Democratic Party candidate, you must be vetted by the powers that be. They look you over and say, are you willing to carry out what we need? They said to Obama, before he became the nominee, are you willing to carry out the imperialist war that we need? In so many words. Oh, yes, I am. And his campaign in 2008 promised that. He said in a campaign speech in his first run, he said, we will do whatever it takes to defend Israel, meaning against Palestine, as a guardian for U.S. capital and profits and geopolitical power in the Middle East. And he said, he warned Hugo Chavez of Venezuela that Hugo Chavez's solidarity with the Latin American countries would no longer be tolerated. This is what Obama promised in order to say, I will be your candidate. And George Bush, he carried out the last execution as governor of Texas in the year 2000, in June 2000, when Shaka Sankofa, who was convicted on, even though he was innocent, he was 17 years old when he was charged with a crime, that now the Supreme Court ruled after his execution that young people under 18 who are convicted cannot be executed. Well, of course, I said, ban the death penalty. But George Bush showed, I am the one who can carry out the police policies, the repressive policies against Black, Latino, and poor people in general. And he executed Shaka Sankofa as governor while he was running for president. So the system itself needs the Democrats and Republicans to control the body politic, to control the people and the political system that they run. They were threatened by Bernie Sanders this year, and they conspired against him. You had a plethora of Democratic candidates, and they conspired as Super Tuesday approached March 3rd to make sure. Some of them withdrew, and then after Super Tuesday, they all withdrew to say Biden is our candidate. Why? Because at that moment, they would rather have Trump, the possibility of being reelected, than to have Bernie Sanders win and upset their system. Because even though his campaign was one of major reforms, it was still within the system. But those kind of reforms, Dan, this government and the corporations and the ruling class as a whole will not accept. They will not accept an increase in taxation. to provide for health care and better education and housing for the people. And so that's why there'll probably be a revolution before there's health care for the masses. There'll probably be a revolution before there's the right to housing, guaranteed right to housing. And I don't think that's an impossibility because the people have the power. When Trump cleared Lafayette Park and brutalized a peaceful demonstration to go make a show with his Bible in front of that church and attacked a crowd and said, we will impose martial law if need be, and ordered the governors to dominate or else he would do it. What happened? Tens of thousands marched the next day in Washington and many other cities and said, this is what we think of your power. We have the power. And that's why the Black Lives Matter movement and the masses of people of all nationalities, all ages, all gender expressions and identity came together, able-bodied and disabled-bodied, young and old. We came together to say, we pushed you back. And that taste of power, of people's power, I believe is going to grow.
Gloria, you mentioned earlier you're a member of a union. I've been in 4 unions over my lifetime. About
What
5.
are they?
What?
What are they?
UFCW, Teamsters, CWA, and AFSCME. But
Really?
5 years ago, I was not working at a unionized company, and the company I worked for was breaking some laws, safety and health, and basically they retaliated against me. I live in Texas, and I was told by a labor lawyer that if I lived in a non-right-to-work state, I could have probably won a few million for what had been done to me, but in right-to-work Texas, I was basically what they say, shit out of luck. If you had the power, that goes back to the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 that gave right-to-work laws. What would you do with right-to-work, the Taft-Hartley Act, or would you issue an executive order to nullify that? And the same thing with Glass-Steagall, which deregulated banks, which is another travesty that happened, I think, 30 years ago.
Well, you have a lot there that is, I agree with you very much. Taft-Hartley was a major attack from which we're still suffering in the labor movement. And we should really call it right to work for less, because that's what those laws are. The labor movement has been greatly weakened to where private corporations, there's only 10%, maybe less, coverage by the union, and somewhat better in public service, but it's still very low. And that's what allows the corporations to continue battling and beating people down who want a union. There was a reform proposition in 2008 that I was, as president of my sector, the typographical sector of the Bay Area, was part of. And it was something that the Communications Workers of America, President Larry Cohen, began. It was called the Employee Free Choice Act. It was truly radical and truly necessary, and we still need it today. But it was effectively killed in 2008, soon after Obama took office. Mm-hmm. He and Hillary Clinton, who were the 2 main candidates at the time in 2008, both promised. In fact, I was a delegate to the CWA convention, and they both appeared on jumbo screen and said, we will sign the Employee Free Choice Act if elected. Well, Obama actually backtracked on that as soon as he was elected. Days before his inauguration. What was the Employee Free Choice Act? It would have allowed workers in any workplace that if they signed 50% plus one of the workers the card saying, I want to be represented by so-and-so union, the union would be automatically in. Avoiding the months of waiting for an election, a recognition election, which during that time in these days, and what the companies do is they bust the union dry. They threaten workers. They call them into captive audiences and say, if you vote for the union, this company will shut down, even though that's illegal. All kinds of pressure. That Employee Free Choice Act would have required the imposition through mediation of a contract once the union was in, within 6 months. Instead of what happens today, where if the company can stall, once the workers vote for a union, if the company can stall for a year then at 1 year and 1 day, 1/3 of the workers who don't want the union can sign a petition asking for whether to decertify the union. And that happens a lot. So that would have banned that. It would have allowed for a union contract within 6 months. But it was defeated because the corporations defeated it. And the politicians who gave empty promises to labor also helped defeat it.
I want to talk about what Andrew Yang, who is a businessman running in the Democratic Party, called the universal basic income. You had mentioned this earlier, so I assume you support some form of it. I myself prefer something called a social wealth fund, which would like to have in Alaska, where all the assets of the state, the nation, basically are a giant municipal fund. I think it's better to fund something like that than UBI through taxes and whatnot. If What is your position on universal basic income or social wealth fund, that kind of thing?
Well, I think it's a way of, I think that universal basic income is kind of a minimal survival amount that's been proposed. Yang did in Europe, they've proposed it and implemented it in some ways. But I think it's really the richest, the billionaire corporations and now trillionaire corporations like Amazon, I think it's their way of giving some crumbs of their massive profits in order to keep the situation quelled. I think they're all the ruling class. You can read it in their analysis in their newspapers, from the Times to the Washington Post to the Wall Street Journal. They're all worried about the popular perception, the true perception of them just amassing profits while people who create their wealth are suffering. And I think it's a way to try to quell the difficulty and the challenge to their system. I believe that we need more employment. Rather than saying, all of you who are excess labor under the system, those of you who we won't employ because our profit rate has to be high, we have to keep labor costs down. I think we need millions of workers in rebuilding the infrastructure of the country, all the bridges, highways, roads. We need potentially hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of child care workers. We need universal child care so the parents can go to work or have help, because every parent needs some relief. And this should be a basic right. We need workers to take care of seniors. In my life, from all the older people I know, because I'm a senior too now, but people who are older too, who need help, or people who are disabled and younger, there's so much need for caregivers so that the families don't get burned out, so the families don't have to quit their job or suffer in having to take care of a loved one, and then that burden really making it not possible to enjoy the relationship with their loved one. We need more teachers. We need a tripling of teachers. We need more medical care workers. We need so much so that everyone's potential can be realized. We need the youth who have been denied any opportunity. African American, Latino, poor white kids, everybody, Native. You talk about the reservations, the lack of development on the reservations, the isolation. We need education, job training, and a decent paid job for everyone. Free healthcare, free healthcare, free education, so that people don't feel like I have to gain hundreds of thousands of dollars, if you can do that, for my retirement. Why should your whole life be about making as much money as you can so that you're not homeless when you get older or have a huge medical bill that wipes you out? That's the state of most people in this country.
Gloria, let me just ask. Let me just ask you. My father was born in 1916. He served in the Civilian Conservation Corps under FDR in the 1930s. When I was a boy in the 1970s, there was a program called CETA, C-E-T-A, which taught a lot of poor kids in the inner city skills. I would assume you're in favor of those types of social programs?
I'm so glad you mentioned CETA, because I tell young people, do you know what CETA was? They go, no, C-E-T-A. I go, that was a training job, and it was summer employment for kids. It used to be, even before CETA, 60s, 50s, 70s, that young people, whether they were high school, even junior high kids, they found employment in the summer. They found a way to make a little money. And there's none of that now. I live in San Francisco where the great wealth is swirling all around us, where gentrification has taken over whole neighborhoods, where you have BART train loads full all morning long, bringing people from the suburbs. Mostly white people, but middle and upper class people who come in to fill the banks, to fill the skyscrapers downtown, to do their job in Facebook, Twitter. And then you have Bayview Hunters Point, Western Addition, the Mission, Visitation Valley, all these neighborhoods where the youth have no opportunity, where they're blamed for their lot. And, where there has been, as I said, economic survival that puts them in prison while the narco trafficking banks like Citibank and Wachovia Bank before it was merged with Wells Fargo were found guilty of, and Bank of America, by the way, found guilty of massive money laundering of narco trafficking.
Yeah.
And so the wealth keeps going up into the top, the wealth that we create again. And so back to the basic income, this basic income unit, whatever. It's a way to stave off rebellion. It's a way to stave off the people rising up and demanding real jobs and real income. Because we need a productive society.
Yeah, there was Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. I couldn't remember what it stood for, but I want to ask you just a few more questions and then let you have a closing statement. And I just want to touch on some of these points, get your general thoughts on it. As a third-party candidate, it's much more difficult to compete in these elections. Do you support fully funded elections by the government rather than having outside corporations? Are you for ranked choice voting? And how would you deal with voter fraud, say, if there is?
I think those two, the ranked voting and the ban on corporate funding of campaigns, certainly. I don't know that that's going to happen because it's become more and more.
Mm-hmm.
Voter fraud is a fraud.
Yeah.
The charge of voter fraud is totally a fraud. You don't have masses of people trying to vote twice or undocumented voting because they're not allowed to. Although I think that the undocumented, who are about 10 to 11 million people estimated, and the 17 million permanent residents who are not allowed to vote. My mother from Mexico lived in the U.S. 67 years, and she never voted because she was a permanent resident. Even though she worked all her life here, raised 6 kids, she never had the right to vote. I think that should immediately, in terms of voter reform, the people who live here should be able to vote.
Yeah, and can I just ask you about quickly? Georgia had their primary for the yesterday, and again we saw that a lot of voting machines, quote unquote, broke down conveniently in mostly minority and poor neighborhoods. So when I talk about voter fraud, I'm talking more along those lines, where like we saw that in California a month or two ago when they had their primary. It's always seeming like these voting machines break down, or someone loses ballots or something.
I would call that systemized voter suppression. Voter suppression by throwing off the 400,000 people in Florida right before the 2000 election. The voter suppression takes place in many ways. But also there's the issue of third-party candidates. The time of the pandemic has really suppressed our right to be on the ballot. We were going to be on the ballot in quite a number of states through the efforts of our volunteers, our members going state to state. We had a full plan, everybody available to go volunteer, to go to petition in these states. And for example, in New Mexico, our members gathered 4,800 signatures in 10 days, which is a remarkable achievement. And then the pandemic hit, and we had to stop it completely. In March, you could not go outside to do it, and nor was it safe, nor would it be right to do. And so we're struggling to get on the ballot in some of the states. I don't think it will be possible in many of them because we still can't go out to petition.
Yeah.
It's not possible. It takes thousands of signatures, and you can't subject people to that.
Let me
and
just,
you would not be able to find people outside like that.
yeah, let me just, two more issues and then we'll wrap up. Global warming and the Green New Deal. Global warming is arguably the biggest issue, even more so than some of the issues we've talked about, because without a planet, nothing else really matters. What are your thoughts on the global warming crisis, and how would you deal with it with something like the proposed Green New Deal or some other way?
The global crisis of warming and everything else related to it is in catastrophic proportion right now. It's hard to imagine a word that can define what we're facing. But we are facing the possible extinction of life on the planet. It sounds ridiculous, but more and more scientists understand this to be a possibility. And it's a possibility because the capitalists are fighting tooth and nail in their competition with each other to outproduce, to make more profit than the other. And so you have this unending production of plastics, for example, which are filling the oceans, of the exploration of every natural resource, primarily oil, fossil fuels, the gold mining, the mining of all valuable minerals, which is helping to create this environmental crisis. But I think the main thing is that the pandemic showed that when the production was greatly slowed down, the planet was starting to heal. The air was starting to clear. But the oceans are in severe distress. And whole species of massive amounts of seafood or sea life that provides food for 1/3 of the planet, the poorest people of all, while the giant trawlers of the corporate, these corporate trawlers are taking everything out that they can from the ocean and depleting the stocks, the acidification of the ocean. There's so many things we can talk about, but I think fossil fuels is the main thing.
Yeah.
And it takes a planned economy. Yeah. Once again, we come back to that. We can't stress enough. A planned economy under socialism could save this planet, and it's absolutely essential now.
Let me talk about, before we give you a closing statement, my final point is on the nation's use of violence, not only within the borders of the U.S., but I read somewhere that in the 244-year history of the United States, we have been at war, depending on how you define it, anywhere from 232 to 236 out of the 244 years, whether it's the American Indian Wars, the Revolutionary Wars, up through Iraq and Afghanistan, and which is ongoing as we tape here. Even someone like President Obama, who's seen as a saint to a lot of left-wing types, ordered the use of drone strikes against what most people would say were non-military targets. What do you think needs to be done to rein in the U.S. penchant for violence or war first without negotiation or without trying other solutions?
Well, first of all, the role of the President of the United States is as the CEO of the capitalist system. Of course, we're running against that. And this is why we don't get the big media coverage or don't get on every ballot of the states. But that's their role, is to defend the system internationally as well. That's what imperialism is the U.S. aim to dominate every region of the world geopolitically, economically, and militarily. That's why there's over 800 U.S. bases occupying hundreds of countries. It's why under Obama, as you said, Obama was, touted as a liberal, and yet the U.S. overthrew the government of Mel Zelaya of Honduras, beginning the reversal of the progressive governments in Latin America. That was under his watch. You had the destruction of Libya, one of the richest country in resources in Africa, which under Gaddafi was aiming to unite the African peoples and countries in solidarity with each other for independence from the US. So we're talking about a system of power, of global domination. And as a candidate and as a socialist activist, as a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Peace and Freedom Party, Liberty Union, what we're advocating is the people getting involved to oppose US war, to oppose US blockade on Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and other countries, to oppose the idea of US military force against people who want to take and have control of the destiny of their lives. And I want to say that if anybody is interested in what we're talking about, interested in socialism, I would recommend that they contact us in our campaign at info, or actually they can check the website, larivapeltier2020.org. And Peltier is Peltier. Leonard Peltier is my vice presidential candidate. We're truly honored that he's running with us. He's in prison 44 years now. He's in Coleman Prison in Florida. He's a victim of the FBI. He's a victim of the U.S. so-called Indian wars that the U.S. engaged in genocidal attack on all the native nations of this country. He represented, along with American Indian Movement and other radical native movements of the 60s and 70s, the idea that native sovereignty, that the respective native treaties to start with should be respected, and to return the land that was stolen from them. He was on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in 1975, June 26th, when the FBI initiated a raid against a camp of people who were defending themselves from the ongoing violence on that reservation. If people want to know his story, check out the movie Incident at Oglala. Oglala is Oglala. I say that because we've got to publicize his case and free Leonard Peltier, along with the other political prisoners. But certainly, we're very proud he's our representative. He is a socialist, by the way. And if you want to check out our campaign in general, or the Party for Socialism and Liberation, you can visit liberationnews.org. And for Peace and Freedom Party, it's peaceandfreedom.org.
Well, unless you have anything further to say, I will link to those websites below this video, both the campaign and the two-party websites. Anyone else who wants to find out more about you or the parties or your issues that you're putting out can contact you that way. So thank you, Gloria, for spending a little over an hour speaking with me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dan.